Hi there, good evening. Thanks for being here. Hello to those of you who are here in person and those who are joining us remotely. I'm Lisa Dale. I'm the director of the MA in Climate and Society here at the Climate School. I'm really happy to be moderating this event today. We're going to be exploring connections between climate change and energy use, talking to 4 of our Climate School experts to better understand the way we're charting a path toward a more sustainable future. It's really the ideal way to honor and celebrate Earth Day, so we're glad to have you here with us today. I'm joined here by 4 members of the faculty who I will briefly introduce, and then you'll have a chance to hear from each of them individually. They're going to do lightning talks, and then we'll all come up at the end of their talks and sit up here and we'll have a little Q&A among us, and then we'll open it up for a chance for audience to ask questions as well. So I'm very happy to introduce our 4 speakers today. Sheila Foster is a professor of climate here at the Climate School. She's an advocate for environmental justice, and she works to ensure that the burdens of climate change don't fall disproportionately on any one group. She's a lawyer and will share some of her legal insights with us. Lisa Sachs is Associate Professor of Professional Practice. She's the director of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, and she's also the director of our brand new master's degree in climate finance that will launch this fall. So we look forward to hearing also from Lisa. Dan Steinart is here. He is the Stanley Thompson Professor of Chemical Metallurgy in the Department of Earth and Environmental Engineering. He is a professor of chemical engineering and of climate at both the Engineering School and the Climate School, so he has a joint appointment. For years, he has studied the limits of energy storage and worked on ways to make batteries more robust and their disposal more sustainable. So we look forward to hearing from Dan. And finally, Ajit Subramaniam is a Lamont Research Professor at the Columbia Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory outside of the city. He's an oceanographer, and he has expanded our understanding of the marine ecosystem, especially the impacts of greenhouse gas emissions on the oceans. So we'll start with these lightning talks, and then we'll all sit up here on the stage. Thank you so much.
Good evening, good to see everyone. I'm going to start with talking about energy democracy and distributive energy as one pathway to equitable and just transition. And this comes a bit out of my background. I am a lawyer, though a lot of my work over the past 20 years or so has been bringing different sectors together, the academic sector, the private, the public, and communities to come up with innovative and creative solutions, working with mayors and others. So I'm going to skip my background since you can look up my profile. But let me just start with the good news, right? The good news is that the energy transition is already underway. From the recent International Energy Association report, we know that there is already a trend toward adopting renewable energy sources, in particular wind and solar, and that each year we see an uptick in these, and by 2035, the share of solar and wind in particular is projected right now, that could change, of course, to exceed 40%, and by 2050, nearly 60%, and this includes EVs, nuclear heat pumps, and various other kinds of energy sources. But although all of us know that our energy bills are too high, a certain percentage of the population, up to as much as 40%, live with what we call energy insecurity. At any moment, they can fall into debt or even lose their home and have to make difficult trade-offs between food and energy. So there's a real affordability gap. A lot of communities don't have the essential infrastructure needed for some of these solutions, including good roofs for solar, and there's a loss of economic opportunities and the benefits that extend to these communities. So there is a move towards more what we might call energy democracy. That's a term of art, but what it really means is moving toward more distributed forms of energy, more transparency and choices in where we get our energy from, and what kind of energy we use and who makes those decisions, and some accountability for the way in which these renewable sources are not really distributed fairly. And essentially, if there's one kind of visual that demonstrates it's a move from what we have now, which is a really centralized system of energy, to one that is more distributive and more local. So what does this look like? Distributive energy includes technologies that really generate power close to the point of consumption. They can be solar, they can be microgrids, they can be battery storage, or some combination of them. One of the things they do is make communities more resilient, in particular, when there are disruptions, and I'll show you a couple of examples of this in a minute. So there are lots of benefits to distributing energy. One kind that we see is community solar, in which there is solar put on a common space in a community. The excess power produced is passed along to the central utility, and they pass back credits to make energy bills more affordable. And there are a lot of different ownership structures. The community could own and govern this. A utility can. It can be on-site, off-site, et cetera. Many, many variations of this. And microgrids is another example of, again, a distributive form of localized energy production that has lots of benefits, including islanding from the larger energy system and integrating renewables, in particular in the event of storms and climate events. A couple quick examples of some of the innovations we see here. One is in Puerto Rico, which is a island, as you know, that has undergone many, many energy disruptions, a cooperatively managed solar microgrid in a small community that is helping it be resilient in a community where severe hurricanes have produced prolonged power outages, and also where they can be the direct beneficiaries of the economic benefits of this kind of distributive energy, including selling electricity back to the Commonwealth grid. And another example is here in Chelsea, Massachusetts, the first community-led cloud-based control system, a microgrid that integrates solar. And it's focused in communities that are at particular risks, so-called environmental justice communities, of flooding and being vulnerable to climate shocks. And again, it creates job and economic benefits. So these are some of the innovations of energy democracy, distributive energy, that both ensure important and fair access to energy, that help to address some of the historical inequities and disadvantages in communities that suffer from energy insecurity and burden, and that support these communities. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the next speaker. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ajit Subramaniam. I'm an oceanographer, and I am going to basically talk about I study phytoplankton. These are microbes that basically make this planet habitable. They provide oxygen. They control climate by taking down carbon dioxide, and they also provide food. And basically, what happens to these organisms when we don't have clean energy, or impacts of dirty energy? I suspect many of you would have seen graphs of this kind, but essentially the point here is that through emissions, our carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere has been going up, and the models basically predict it to go up even higher, faster, if we don't change what we do. And one of the consequences to that is that global temperatures have also been going up with consequences. In terms of microbes, the consequences are profound. I was one of the co-authors of a recently released study that was led by the National Academy of Sciences to lay out the groundwork, the plans for oceanographic research for the next 10 years. And as a panel, we found that the three most important things that we need to understand better is the ocean's capacity to take up heat, take up carbon dioxide, and how that might affect ecosystem resilience, and how that might affect extreme weather events. As you can imagine, as you probably have seen in papers, extreme weather events come from hurricanes, and the other big thing is basically how CO2 goes into the ocean. You probably all have heard of the term ocean acidification, a little bit of chemistry, and you put CO2 in the water, you produce hydrogen, and you produce bicarbonate. By taking up the carbonate ions, you're basically reducing the ability of coral reefs and shellfish to form, to calcify, and there's a fairly large economic number that's associated with it. So while we constantly hear about the cost of transition, we don't often hear the cost of not doing the right thing, and so this is useful to see. The other part of it is essentially what's happening with ocean warming. And again, these are actual temperatures that have been measured. So you're looking here at sea temperature anomalies from a mean. And these are heat waves. And this is something that we didn't really understand till about 10 years ago, the extreme marine heat waves that happen. And you can see from this fairly busy graph that it affects almost every part of ocean life. The most recent one is something that made the newspaper quite a bit, the blob that was hanging off the coast of California. And you can see that it essentially hits every sustainability goal that we need to worry about. And this also has profound economic costs associated with it. So again, the take home from this is essentially that heat waves are happening in the ocean, and it percolates through to human society by increasing cost of food, by changing the ecosystem. But we have to do something about that. Oceans can basically sequester carbon is one idea. So this whole idea is that we need to reduce the amount of emissions we're putting out there, but that alone is not going to be enough. We also have to take out carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And so I'm just going to finish up with that little bit there, which is the role of oceans in carbon removal. Oceans cover 70% of the Earth's surface, and therefore we should be able to use that if we need to do something about it. You would have probably seen headlines like this in the last couple of years about these massive seaweed blobs that is approaching Florida. This is a new population of seaweed that has essentially come into being since about 2010 and is causing enormous economic damage. Now, it is not a 5,000-mile blob as it is portrayed in this New York Times article. That's basically what it looks like from a research vessel. That's when we were out in the equatorial Atlantic. And that's basically the blooms of sargassum that you see going out there. And one of the ideas that we are thinking about is how do we prevent both economic damage from these seaweeds washing up on small islands where they basically pile up on beaches about a meter high and cause loss of economic activity because tourists can't use the beaches anymore, but at the same time, I remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere as well by sinking these seaweed down to the seafloor at depths greater than 2,000 meters. So we are basically trying to come up with a scheme where we're using robotic platforms and remote sensing and AI to try and track these blooms of seaweed out in the ocean, capture them in nets, and sink them down to the seafloor, by which we can both simultaneously reduce economic harm to islands and remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. With that, I shall lead off to Lisa.
Thank you so much. Such an incredible privilege to work alongside such expertise in diverse areas. Every day is Earth Day, right, at the Climate School, and so extraordinary presentations. I'm going to give a very quick snapshot of the financing challenges for scaling renewable energy, and particularly in low and middle income countries, or emerging market and developing economies, as we call them, EMDEs. So first, just to give you a sense of the scale of the financing gap, this is on the left is the main thing to look at, which is the enormous more than $8 trillion annual financing gap for clean energy. This is globally, and that cost, the gap is only increasing in future years, both in mitigation and in adaptation. Just to note that this is not for a scarcity of capital. It's not that the world doesn't have enough global savings. We do. It's just the misallocation of capital in terms of which industries are being financed and which geographies. So this is purely a challenge of where the capital flows. This is a snapshot of where the capital flows, but the couple things that I would want to point out, first of all, just to note that most climate finance comes from public sources. That's the blue, so it's a lot of public sources. But the second column is notable, which is that by far the biggest chunk, the bottom is more individual household, but the biggest chunk in the middle indicates that most climate finance is at commercial terms. It's just normal market-based financing, as opposed to the top two, which are either grant, or which means that it doesn't need to be repaid, or concessional financing, so more affordable. But the bulk of financing is at market rate. By far, most of it goes to mitigation, which for our purposes today is okay because renewable energy is, but from the world's perspective is not, because adaptation is so massively underfunded. And then even within mitigation, which is what we're talking about today, Look at the tiny percentage that goes to emerging markets at the top, or to all other regions. By far, the most goes to China. That's the bottom, which is good. They're leading on the energy transition, to Western Europe, to the US, but a tiny proportion, about less than 15% of climate finance goes to emerging markets in general, and about 1% to low-income countries. A main reason for that is the extraordinarily high cost of capital, how much capital costs in emerging markets relative to developed countries. So this is across a few emerging markets: Brazil, India, Indonesia, Mexico, shows what roughly the cost of capital is, how much it costs to access finance relative to the average for advanced economies on the side, in the green bar. So capital is much more affordable in developed countries. This is both reinforced by and reflective of and reflective of the bond yields for emerging markets, how much emerging markets have to pay on their debt. So again, you see the same picture of emerging economies paying much more interest on their debt, or the cost of debt and equity much higher than in developed countries. What's particularly perverse and ironic is that emerging markets have a much higher growth rate. They're growing much faster than developed countries, and yet the cost of capital is much higher. This is particularly important for renewable energy, because renewable energy investments have a high upfront capital cost. So the cost of capital is decisive in whether fossil fuel-based energy or clean energy is more cost-effective in emerging markets. So reducing even the cost of capital by 1% can have a profound impact on the affordability, or the relative affordability, of clean energy. This is just showing the cost of capital for solar in Africa is more than 18% compared to less than 5% in Europe and the US. The high cost of capital is reflective of a basic principle, which is that much of the world views emerging markets as risky environments. Actually, I shouldn't say much of the world. It's 3 credit rating agencies, S&P, Fitch, and Moody's, that control the sovereign risk ratings, and their ratings are determinative of so many investment decision makings, and they deem poor countries to be risky. On the right shows the rating relative to GDP. So poor countries are rated low. Wealthy countries are rated high. It is built into the methodology. GDP per capita is explicitly built into the methodology, and it's implicit in subjective assessments of institutional quality and the fact that high-income countries have access to more liquidity. They borrow in their own currency, so there are many structural reinforcing reasons, subjective and objective, that developed countries are deemed to be more creditworthy. But the end effect is that low-income countries, that's the top line, not a single low-income country gets a credit-worthy rating from the credit rating agencies, not a single one. And 2 low-middle income countries do, and it's only because of their population size: Philippines and India. So I will just end on this. We just very timely released a report last couple days ago, 3 days ago or so, that looks at the many interrelated, but there are many distinct aspects of the high cost of capital, the factors that underpin the high cost of capital, and we offer pathways to reform, structural reform of, first of all, how we assess credit rating agencies, addressing misperceptions of risk, because the data underscore that not only are these risk ratings self-reinforcing, but the evidence of default rates in emerging markets shows that they're far more creditworthy than the ratings would suggest. We look at other mechanisms to actually meaningfully de-risk investments in emerging markets to the extent that the risks are real, which there are some, because they're emerging economies and they don't have as strong fundamentals in some cases. So how can we meaningfully use guarantees and credit enhancements to bring in more private capital, and looking at different blended finance models? So these are explored in this report, and it's one of the main things that we're working on at the center at CCSI, and we'll be teaching in our program. So thank you again very much.
Tough acts to follow. Hi, I'm Dan Steinart, newly appointed faculty in the Climate School. I'm also the chair of Earth Environmental Engineering, and I think this title could also be the secondary motto for my department. What I want to motivate I'll try to convey all the excitement that I sold to my research group. We're at a super exciting moment. I think a real singularity in the way energy flows, just in the world, just period. When I took thermodynamics for the first time in 1998, it was standard mechanical engineering, power plant thermodynamics. You take fossil fuels cost somewhere, 20, 25 adjusted, between 3 and 5 cents per kilowatt hour. You burn them, you run a Rankine cycle or a Brayton cycle as well as you can. You hope you get you hope you get a total efficiency of somewhere between 40 and 50 cents. You sell the electricity for 10 cents, and then everything in between is the profit you make, right? So electricity is fundamentally expensive stuff. Fossil fuels are fundamentally cheap stuff, and the way all utilities work is you arbitrage that difference and run it as well as you can. I didn't learn at all about CO2 production. There was an environmental segment to the class. It was about not heating up the runoff of the cooling water too hot so you didn't kill the fish in the ocean. Right? That was the extent of environmental engineering and mechanical engineering thermodynamics in 1998. The world has changed enormously, right? We've seen multiple presentations on the ability of photovoltaics to meet an incredible amount of our energy needs at cost parity with fossil fuels. Now, sun is diurnal, and regardless of what we do, the sun will always be diurnal. Depending on how we behave, wind will blow more often, but with less controlled frequency. So we need buckets of storage, simply IKEA for electrons, to back this up. And historically, batteries are just shockingly expensive, right? They were shockingly expensive when I started my PhD. And everyone thought they were always going to be too expensive. And now, 25 years later, they are cheap enough when paired with photovoltaics in an almost cost-unsubsidized way to back up 10 hours of energy. And with subsidy, let's say 10 hours. Without subsidy, 4 to 5 hours, right? That's just what the costs are now in a world without tariffs. You can ask me what the tariffs will do to those costs, or you can do the math in your head. So we're at this moment where electrons, and not phonons, not thermal energy, is the cheapest source of energy, right? Like we're at that inflection point. And choices we make now will determine how we proceed. And it's not an if, but a when. When can we do this, right? So it's an enormously exciting moment to be a scholar of batteries and electrochemistry, because now for the first time, it's cheaper to refine chemicals with electricity than with thermal sources, right? We're at the crossover point now, and in somewhere between 5 and 50 years, depending on how quickly we can accelerate these processes, we will just not need to burn stuff at the same level. Will we need to do combustion at all? Probably, and we can argue how much combustion will be required to run things going forward. So it's again, enormously exciting moment to get this. I co-direct a center with Alan West, another faculty of the Climate School. Chemical engineer is his main appointment, where this is all we think about. We have 10 faculty plus an exceptional executive director, or 11 faculty plus an exceptional executive director, Jeff Fitz, and we think about everything from the interface that's crucial to make a battery or fuel cell electrolyzer work, all the way to the system level, the stuff that Sheila was talking about, how to make this all talk to one another and how to minimize its degradation on the grid. The clever color coding says what departments we are, and the little green dashes are the folks that are in the climate school. And so what does this mean? Well, the beauty of electrons is that they're inherently bidirectional, right? So typically you need to burn something and you send the heat in one direction, right? Fundamentally, heat has to move in one direction. That's the second law of thermodynamics. Electrons can move bidirectionally. Because electrons can move bidirectionally, they can be reversibly processed either in a system or between systems, right? So the same fundamental principles of grid forming that we talked about that will enhance, that have been spoken about today, that will enhance the stability of energy systems will be applicable to making chemicals green. And I'm happy to chat about that as well. So what do? I think about this equation all day long, right? As an engineer, I think about this equation all day long, and I'm sorry to be both over time and showing you a nasty equation, but basically the goal is to make that LCOS as small as possible. This is an economics relationship. It has no physical parameters explicitly coded, but implicitly, there are all these interesting questions a battery scientist can ask and how these things are physically coupled. And so what I have been obsessed with for the last decade, and when I was putting this together, I realized it's been a decade, it's been a long time, maybe I need to work on something else, is the purplish thing, maintenance. How do we make a battery system that will just last forever and is really, really cheap to maintain? So here are some cool movies on what we've done. So in 2015, I figured out two things. One is that a AA battery will bounce depending on its state of charge. And based on that, we have launched a company that is using sound waves to tell you how good your battery is or is not. And it turns out sound speed is a fundamental property of the way batteries operate. On the right-hand side, we took what we learned from the left-hand side to design a battery that can never break. And so the first picture is the first cell in a beaker, and 10 years later, that's the result of a couple of PhDs in a concretely controlled chaos, right? So we're at a point now where electrochemical systems are not only cheap in terms of their capital cost, but we're on the precipice of making them last forever. So they're assets that simply won't degrade like batteries normally do, and we can think about them as proper grid assets that last 40 or 50 years. Thank you.
Thanks to you all. That was pretty spectacular. Tore through some of the climate school's experts. We got to hear from law, microbiology, finance, and engineering. So that's a good smattering of the kind of expertise we have at the climate school. I have a couple of questions, and I'm going to target those to a couple of you in particular for each question. So let me start with Ajit and Sheila. You talked about very different dynamics, but you were both talking about in some sort of, in some context. Ajit, you talked about heat waves and the impacts of ocean heat waves on human communities. And Sheila, you talked about the affordability gap. And so I want to make that connection, and I wonder if we can think about how we navigate that affordability gap and protection of vulnerable communities as we travel this energy transition.
So it's a difficult gap for me to jump, but I'm going to just start with a small vignette of where I work, another place where I work, which is in the Arctic, where the permafrost is thawing, and more importantly, the food that the people need there for subsistence is disappearing, and we are having toxic algae that is starting to grow in many of these places where food affordability becomes an issue. And energy is extremely expensive because it is gas is flown in. These are remote villages where the only way to get there is by boat during the summer, or you fly in otherwise it's an air flight. And there is not much by way of other forms of energy yet. There was just the beginning of installation of wind and solar, and it's unclear how that's going to go going forward. So it's expensive, there's a big gap, and they're really confronting major climate-related challenges.
Yeah, and I would add, so I focus most on the U.S., but there is, I think, an affordability, but also an access question, right? The access, so much of, sub-Saharan Africa and many people around the world aren't even connected to energy systems at all, right? Including centralized systems. And these models are popping up there too. So it's not just solving the insecurity and the affordability, but also the access gap. On the insecurity and affordability, one of the things is to your point about vulnerability, I would separate people who are vulnerable to the impacts of climate shocks or for slow onset like heat waves, and their resiliency, right? So to be vulnerable, we all suffer in a heat wave, right? Our energy costs go up. But how do you emerge from that, and how do you sustain surviving through that? And that is where I think you see these models that first making it affordable for folks to keep air conditioning on, let's say, or to have air conditioning. And second, that when you are hit with the shock, as in Puerto Rico, or if you're in a low-lying flooding area, that you're able to bounce back more quickly to get your energy up and going. And that's for all kinds of vulnerable populations, including people who also depend on machines medically. So that's what they're responding to, is there's a multi-dimension factor, I think, to these energy issues as for how they impact vulnerable populations.
Fascinating, thank you. It really highlights how even in a climate mitigation setting, we are coming up against resiliency gaps and the need to pay attention to the way adaptation and mitigation, I think, interact. So thanks, thoughtful. This one's for Lisa and Dan. Let's talk about finance a little bit more. And I'm very interested in the way some of the financial models that you were showing on the screen, Lisa, apply to energy storage and apply to the battery challenge that you're working on, Dan. So I would appreciate comments on that issue from either.
Want to start?
They do very much, actually, going from emerging markets to newer technologies, even in developed countries. The financing, the main principle of the challenge of financing things that are deemed riskier or not well known is similar. So we need, and so that is true in storage, which is that financing is now flowing to generation, to renewable energy generation. The costs have come down, they're proven technologies, but storage is now well understood to be absolutely critical in energy systems, but the technologies are more emergent and what they look like is newer, and so financing is not flowing at scale. So all the same kind of credit enhancements that we are looking to scale in emerging markets are being and should be even more deployed in developed country contexts too. Guarantees and concessional finance and catalytic finance that can bring in private sector finance, and that is how you accelerate confidence in an investment. And the one other piece that I would mention that I think is really interesting is the role that data centers and other industrial users can play in making storage more financeable. This is something that we're looking at, which is that data centers in particular really use and could use storage, and actually one of the determinants of whether a new technology is financeable is whether there's a offtake, whether there's someone that will use the technology. So if data centers or other industrial uses, but data centers are quite interesting now, can commit to using the storage or work with the grid designers to build storage near to the data centers, that could really accelerate financing for storage solutions.
I couldn't agree more, and offtake is perks up any private equity investor interested in transition solutions. Upstream of where Lisa was discussing solutions, there's a new set of tariffs that have I don't want to say upended the energy transition in the U.S., but it creates a bit of a catch-22. And I was just on a call with a sponsor as I was walking here. Look, without tariffs, it would make no sense to produce batteries or PV cells in the United States. The margins are order 5%, and the compression on the margins is enormous. The downstream value is significant. I just don't think that we have the vehicles in the capital markets to handle this. Now, with the tariffs, there's enough know-how, and it has to be imported from China, but there's enough know-how to get it done in the U.S. And frankly, the amount of automation that's required to produce cells at both the quality and cost, both photovoltaic cells and battery cells at the quality and cost that are required, means that I don't think there's any such thing as a green job. in manufacturing. The extent of automation that has to happen needs to eliminate it. The variability of humans is just too high. And I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing, it's just an objective thing. But what this means is that robots can be robots anywhere as long as they have cheap electricity and the ability to be maintained. The current challenge with the tariffs is how durable they will be. They need to be durable for at least 2 presidential terms in order to make any real investment in factories in the U.S. So there's a bit of a paralysis right now on what we do about this. Do I bite the bullet and pay 125% or whatever it is, 145% tariff for imports from China because 80% of both PV cells and battery cells come from China? Do I wait a couple of years to see how things play out? When do I need them? And my biggest fear is that it just stalls demand. So this is a very long way of saying that I think in what I do and what my sponsors think about, the best way climate finance could help is by creating vehicles that somehow guarantee demand, regardless of where the cells are produced. If demand can be guaranteed at certain levelized costs, and if the risk can be spread out between the upstream producers that are making like dog food margins and the downstream producers, downstream users that, if they're using these AI models, are making a lot of money, if somehow that risk can be pooled, and if climate finance can provide a model for do this, it would save the day right now. Because the technology exists to get this done, and it's just a question of how much demand will exist to accelerate it.
Thank you. This next question, I think, is primarily for Sheila and Lisa because they teach in the core program, in the Climate and Society program. So a core course is required for all of our students. So these are our really central professors in the university, although we also certainly welcome thoughts from Dan and Ajit on these questions. What's the role of the climate school in all this? How are we preparing our students to tackle these layered, nuanced, and complicated issues?
Yeah, and I think it is complicated. The energy system is complicated. So I teach climate law and policy, I teach energy justice seminar and climate justice, and in all of them, trying to help students understand how the systems work. And part of that is policy systems. So for instance, everything I pointed to needs an enabling environment. So if you're going to do community solar, if you're going to do microgrids, you have to work with the utility system, which is an investor-owned system, and it's heavily centralized and it's heavily regulated. And you need states to have net metering laws, right, to pass credits back to the solar system, or you need connection access, right, if you're going to do a microgrid, although the cloud-based microgrid gets around that. So in those ways, I think that it's important to understand, you know, if you care about climate change, where can the change be made? And to understand where the change can be made, where, you know, how does the electricity system work in the U.S.? Do we understand that there's a wholesale market and a retail market? And the wholesale market is interstate, and the retail market is state by state, and that we have various different systems. There's not just one system. So that complication, I think, and if you're concerned about justice, you know, how are kind of vulnerable and marginalized communities even supposed to participate? In fact, they're often going to be on the losing end, because as we move to renewables, if they don't have access to those, then traditional legacy fossil fuel systems will cost more, and they'll be stuck in those, right? And it'll just kind of recreate all kinds of inequality. So that's what we're trying to teach our students here, is an understanding of that.
Great. Love it, and would just underscore one component and add two. The one component I would underscore after I've been at Columbia for 21 years, and what is so decisive and so unique and wonderful about the climate school is its orientation toward impact and problem solving. So this is a school that is looking to address a challenge, and that is incredible and wonderful. So that, and Sheila said that. The two pieces that I would add to that is, first of all, how incredibly interdisciplinary our programs are, and that is through real partnerships with other schools, with engineering, with the business school, with law, and others. And every program, not only do most faculty members have different multidisciplinary backgrounds, but every program ensures that students understand the multidisciplinary nature of both the challenges and the solutions. And then the third piece I would add is the imperative of critical thinking in this space, and that we know a lot more than we're doing on this planet because of a lot of siloed thinking and institutional inertia and so on. And so trying to encourage our students to really think about the narratives, the challenges, and how they can do things differently when they go back out into practice.
I love that line, we know more than we're doing. That's a takeaway.
If I can quickly add to Lisa's point, I think that these are wicked problems, and being able to see them from different angles, from a very transdisciplinary way, actually allows us to shine light on these things and see them with different eyes. Last week, we had a panel on ocean deep sea mining with an anthropologist and a geochemist. Tomorrow, we're going to have a panel on ocean sound with a person who does ocean acoustics for seafloor tectonics and someone who does shark calling. So for us, we really explore some of these problems by looking at them from very different angles, and I just love that.
I'll add one thing, because I want to be consistent for the students I have that are taking my class that are here in the audience. Look, the Columbia College School of Art and Sciences studies principles. The engineering school studies technologies. The policy school studies policy. What's crucial to have an outcome between the technologies and the policy are products. And I think because the climate school is a master's program and it's professionally focused, this is, and people are here because they both care about climate change, they believe that climate change will affect us within our lifetime, and they want to see solutions to it. These are the people best suited to actually make the products that integrate the principles and technology to get this done while listening to the policy folks. So I think that's the singular need for the climate school and what makes it unique really in the world.
Thank you. I'm always astounded by this because you always hear, academia is so siloed. And I think that's not the academia where I work. We are not siloed. We are in it together, and it's really a tremendous learning environment. So we're going to open it up to questions now from the audience. We have a couple of people with microphones. Please speak into the microphone so that our people on Zoom can hear you, and we can record this conversation. If you have a question, raise your hand, and they will come around.
Thanks for very interesting presentations. I'm curious about how many of the panelists are working on projects that depend directly or indirectly on federal funding. And I'm not talking about the current dispute about the $900 million. I'm talking about the extreme hostility, and starting at the very top at the White House, towards directing any federal resources towards climate science. So how many of you are directly or indirectly dependent on federal funding now? Is there a plan B if that funding dried up? How would you continue your projects?
All my projects are funded by the federal government. There is one proposal that was selected for an award that has been held up. That is to study the toxicity of cyanobacterial blooms that are happening in the Arctic. And we are still hopeful that it'll come through, because it is actually human life that we are now talking about, waiting to see what happens.
I would say about 50% of my funding is federal. I specifically moved to Columbia from Princeton because Columbia in 2019 had a much more industry-friendly funding model. Princeton, you don't talk about money at Princeton, so getting other sources other than the federal government was seen as gauche. I'm planning on getting less and being less dependent, just going forward for a couple of reasons that I can bore you with, even outside of the current federal administration. I think that. As I said, what's great about the schools, we have to be closer to the product, and we have to think about how products translate into results. Technologies don't translate into results, products translate into results, and industrial funding requires products. We don't work on products, we don't do optimization, we work on fundamental things. So I think there's a push and a pull. I think I don't want to excuse in any way the current federal stance on it. I think it's going to decimate science In the U.S., I'm going to be okay because I'm a mercenary, but it really is going to hurt everybody in a pretty significant way.
Yeah, so I would just add, I'm not affected directly by the funding, but I think it's more than just the funding. There are a lot of agencies that have taken down critical data and science that I think we all rely upon. And, some universities are trying to preserve some of that, but I think that the assault is really an assault on knowledge and science, and the funding is just a means. So, and I think it's that some of us or all of us at the universities and at the climate school will be trying to fill in those gaps, at least on the science and data.
Maybe add a slightly another perspective. So our center has never received federal funding from the U.S. government. We've received support from other governments that have consistently supported practice-oriented solutions work in the rest of the world. And so we're not directly affected, except for devastation about what's happening in this country, but this field is growing. The field of climate finance and accelerating climate finance and climate science and climate innovation around the world. And when in the rest of the world, they remain committed, serious. There's good work being done on innovation, serious discussions on financing and solutions. And we have always done international work, and it may be that we have always done international work, but it may be that we, as a faculty, again, work even more with our international partners who remain steadfast on the climate journey.
Thanks, good question. Next question. I see one in the back.
Thank you. This question is primarily for Ms. Sachs, but interested to hear any other thoughts on it. When you talk about the emerging and developing market risk premium for climate financing, does that already include or is it considered for other, I think usually when we think of like utilities and grids, we think of like municipal and government owned. Does that include potential for like private actors or foreign actors within that? Is that already baked into that premium, or is that a potential area to maybe bring down that risk, or is that considered like a sovereignty thing or something like that?
It's a great question that's complicated, but I'll try to provide a relatively straightforward answer because it's a really great question. First of all, an additional perversity of the risk ratings is that de facto all projects within a country are limited in their risk ratings by the sovereign risk rating, no matter any other fundamentals within the country. So if you're a project operating within a country that's deemed to be risky, the project is limited by that risk ceiling. That's odd. The way to shape that, in fact, it is through these enhancements and through other legal innovations, which is somehow done. But so the ownership structure doesn't help, actually, in many cases. But there's another component to what you're saying, which is that another constraint of financing, a real constraint, by the way, is that in emerging markets, there needs to be a lot of work to structure energy systems and to figure out the right mechanism or the right role for the utility, the right role for the private sector, and so on. What's the grid design? And this is where technology and planning and the law and the regulatory framework can be helpful in meaningfully de-risking investments in emerging market grids when there's clarity on the roles of the different players, there's clarity on where the private sector's finance is useful, what are the structures that enable to get the return, how can the regulatory framework support that regulatory environment, and so on. So we have to address both components. But the risk ratings that I was showing you is irrespective of the ownership structure in the of the energy system.
Great, thanks. More questions?
Good evening. I wanted to piggyback on something Professor Foster said. You talked about environmental justice communities perhaps being left behind with fossil fuels. Could you just expand on that? Why wouldn't they be in a new electrified building, for instance?
Yeah, so they could be, right? So the transition process, whether it's towards decarbonization, electrified buildings, we have great laws in the book here in New York, including 70% of greenhouse gases comes from building here. So we have a local law that targets buildings for reduction. Those are going to be newer buildings, right? And newer buildings mean more expensive buildings. And just like when we rely on, let's say, building more housing units for affordable housing, what we're really doing is saying we build new buildings, unless you means test them, people are going to leave the older ones that can pay and go to the better ones, and they'll leave the older stock for more affordable housing, quote unquote. And the problem with that is that the innovation that leaves those folks behind. And I think the same with the energy system, right? Yes, solar's coming down, the price of solar's coming down. Yes, the price of these renewables are coming down, but you do need the infrastructure. If you're living in older housing or an older multifamily or in public housing, you can't put solar panels on top of those buildings, right? And who's going to finance that? Most of them you can't. I mean, some you can, depending on the roof. So what that means is that there will be certain communities left into an old system in which they lack choice, right, to transition without subsidies and without, I think, an enabling environment. Now, some cities have, community solar and solar for all. That's helping. There were subsidies from the Inflation Reduction Act in the previous administration. Those are going away. There are some at the state level. I think my point is that the transition needs more than just a transition to renewables, but it does need that equity component in order to bring everyone else along, or they'll be left into an old system that we hope is going away, but that has its deeply, deeply seated inequities. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
I'll add just one thing. I'm not an expert on this in any way, other than I know how a battery works. But what I see in California and what I see in Texas, because of the grid failures, is the haves prepping and not even microgridding, but just saying, okay, I can just go off grid. Right. It's cheap enough that I can do this. And when people aren't paying into the utilities, the utility still has to pay for the wires, the utility still has to pay for energy, and that cost gets pushed to folks that have less. And so we have a choice in which we can choose to network these new technologies and encourage people that are, and enable people that are installing these locally to share and provide access, and that'll actually have some spillover, or we can keep current regulatory structure and say anything behind the meter basically stays there. Yes, there's some net metering. Yes, you can do it, but there's no way of really coordinating and controlling it like in those examples you showed, and you really have to want to do it. And so we're at a moment now where we can ask, it sounds crazy, but we can ask people who have more to share and to share their ability to have a LEED Platinum something or other. We just need the policy and legal framework to allow it.
Which Texas does not have, by the way.
Texas
is totally deregulated,
yep,
right? Has its own grid.
Yep.
Yeah, and that's why. I think.
But California sort of has the problem as well,
true.
And they're on the other end, right? Like it's just easy for people who have a lot of money there to say, I'm not dealing with this.
Well, that's everywhere. That's true. Yeah.
Thanks. A question for Professor Sachs. I work in solar and storage development, so we are experiencing the tariffs in real time, today especially. But a question, I guess I'm trying to see the silver lining in them, and one silver lining I'm seeing is that by reducing demand for cheap, clean technologies from Southeast Asia, where they're primarily manufactured, do we potentially create an opportunity for those technologies to be dispersed from China specifically to emerging and developing economies if they're cheaper and they have a lot of kind of excess supply that's not coming to the U.S. So is that a right silver lining?
Definitely. I was wondering where you're going with that. Yes. Yes. A sad silver lining is that as the U.S., which has never honestly been a real climate leader in the world, more explicitly retreats, it paves the way for for other climate leadership, which we will see, and for other financing mechanisms, and we will see that. I've been spending time in China, where, by the way, the past couple of years, China has financed more of the energy transition, the infrastructure and the components of the infrastructure than the rest of the world combined. and is investing in all parts of the world, with electric vehicles, with the components for energy systems, with the energy systems themselves. So I don't think that the tariffs will drive this. They would have done this anyway. But I think that there's been I think that it does pave the way for even more leadership from countries that are going to finance. So I don't know if it's a silver lining, but it's reassuring for sure that the scale of that the commitments, I think, are accelerating in the rest of the world. And as I keep saying, it's up to the US to try to keep up and to be a part of financing the future, the financial institutions as much as the technology and so on. But this is the US's leadership to lose, which is what's happening. But yeah, the rest of the world will, I do think that the rest of the world is committed to real financing and to addressing these challenges.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
So we actually have a question from someone joining over Zoom. Where do you see AI or data-driven tools being genuinely useful in accelerating energy equity, and where might we need to be more cautious?
I think it's pretty well overhyped. I mean, I think I was, I ran into colleague Vishal, who is the AI guru in engineering, and I asked him a very similar question just this morning, and it's like anyone who uses ChatGPT for anything. It gives you 90% of one answer, as in it does a lot of legwork and it stops a lot of busy work, but any thought and any hard decision that has to be made still has to be made by a person. So I think that, it's a tool that helps draft and helps your grammar work, and to the extent that that's useful, then it will accelerate that. I'm going to take someone's going to yell at me for this, but I think that it's generally an optimizer and something that is sort of somewhere between first and second order. If there's an answer, if there's a needle in a haystack, it helps find that needle much faster, and that works great. But if you need a brand new solution and something that hasn't been thought of before, it can't do that. It just has no capability to do that whatsoever. So I don't put much stock in it as a solution. It's a wonderful tool.
I actually wouldn't dare to override that, because I will learn from you on this. But just to share maybe a slightly positive perspective, because I am very interested in the role that data centers and technology could play. I already just addressed one, which is not on the AI in particular, but just that the growth in data centers and technology usage can play a very important demand pull role for scaling clean energy around the world, wherever it's based. But that should be expected of it, because it's not going to happen on its own. Historically, any major industrial energy user will use the cheapest, most available resource. In some places that will be renewable, but not always. So I think that there should be a concerted effort to use these new energy pulls to decidedly scale both grid expansion and storage solutions. And that's one important area. I also do think that we should more concertedly explore the role that tech and AI can play in making systems smarter, in thinking about where, in managing, we can get more information about demand and use new tech tools, as I understand, to shift where I'm talking to a big tech company that thinking about where, queries to a data center go, which data center do they go to, so that you can manage the demand on the grid. So is it magic? Probably not. I'm glad to hear we still need humans, because I don't want my own job to be replaced. But I do think that we should be calling on tech companies to help think positively and constructively about the use cases, both of their energy demand, but also the tools they can use to make systems smarter. Right,
absolutely. Let me clarify something. AI is an incredible energy hog, and it gets you one, nuanced answer very, very slowly. In terms of optimizing routes for energy, absolutely, but you don't need AI for that, right? Like right? It's just good old-fashioned operations research. I mean, old-fashioned, right? It was cutting edge 3 years ago, but it's it does not help with routing problems. It does not help with high-speed problems. Was talking with a friend of mine who does dual-use stuff yesterday, and the way you would think about it is this: if you put a set of eyes and ears on ChatGPT and asked it to navigate around a room, what would it do, right? It would sort of bang around and ask a bunch of circular questions and then lie down. It's not designed to do anything else. It's not designed to do anything else. So I think that maybe this is what the questioner was getting at. Yes, we can use AI as a catch-all for new technology, and sure, absolutely new technology would be useful. But if we're speaking about AI as we know it, LLMs, and the ability to reason, I bank it in the fusion camp. One day it will have a massive impact, but we might all be underwater if we just wait for that.
On that note, we are just about out of time, and I think this has been a real showcase of the interdisciplinary strength of the Climate School, the issues we're wrestling with, the way our disciplines speak to each other, and the work we're doing that combines scholarship with teaching here at the Climate School. So, as discussed here, we are facing headwinds. I think we all know this. We are especially grateful for your support in that circumstance. And we welcome your ongoing support by attending our future events. We have many, and I think if you're on our list, you are informed of those, but if you're not on the list, get on the list and we'll keep you updated. So you can attend our events, stay informed through our regular newsletters, or give a gift, and we have our development officers here to talk to you about that if you're interested. Thanks again for making the time to be here with us tonight and asking such good questions. Be well. Good night. Thank you.